Here's a quick story about Africa. Long, long ago, there was a land called Africa, or to be more accurate, Alkebulan, meaning mother of humankind or even Garden of Eden. Now from this garden rose great kingdoms. From the Asante in the west, the nation of Kemet in the north, Mapungubi in the south. Africans, or rather, Alkebulanites, built great cities of immense wealth that few thought would ever fall. Until the dawn of the 15th century, which marked the beginning of a new era that would eventually be known as the European colonial period. For the next almost 500 years, Alkebulan would see its kingdoms fall, cities destroyed, libraries burned to the ground. And all of this was in order to erase Alkebulan's history from the minds of the Alkebulanites. Because once they had forgotten their history, their identity would go with it, which would leave them vulnerable to a new false narrative. And for many years, the truth of our past was hidden, lost, never to be seen again. Although few remembered, it wasn't until early 2015 when the youth of our country began to answer a call for the fall of roads, then the fall of fees, and eventually a call for the decolonization of education itself. Because these students understood that you cannot free a person who has never learnt the true meaning of freedom. So if freedom begins with our minds, and education is the gardener that plants the seeds of our knowledge, then in order to free our minds, we must first decolonize the education that we receive. This is made in Africa, and today we shall begin to decolonize education. This is the African Leadership Academy. Like any ordinary academy, there are buildings, teachers, students, and green grass. The sciences are learned through laboratories, history on the stage, leadership in practice, and identity through debate. With the goal of molding 6,000 future African leaders, the challenge of decolonizing education is something they live with every single day. In order to ensure that Africa's future leaders do not repeat the mistakes of our leaders from the past, this academy is forced to face difficult and uncomfortable questions in contribution to our continent's freedom. Because it is important to understand that you cannot cure a disease before diagnosing it. So we must take into consideration that we cannot decolonize education before we ask ourselves a simple question. What does colonized education look like?
That's a great question. So I think to start talking about colonized education, it's useful to think about what role education has played in society historically and the purpose for which it was engineered.
We need to ask ourselves, what is the function of colonization? Right? And the function of colonization, in my humble opinion, is direct and total control over the colony and its people.
I believe that colonized education was an attempt, both strategically and fortuitously by the colonial masters, to introduce an education system that eliminated African identities and perspectives from the knowledge that was being taught.
Education that entrenches the mindsets or the attitudes that were put upon Africans in the colonial days. And we are still stuck in studying certain things about Africa that were defined by our colonial masters. So that could be parts of our history that were hidden away because they were not what the colonial masters wanted to the African to believe and see.
And even before turning to the topic of colonialism, it's easy to trace a line between the way education is constructed for most of us today and the way it was put together, some people would say, for the Industrial Revolution, right? Where you wanted to create a system where you could input individuals at the beginning and get individuals at the end that were standardized in the way that they were relating to power, relating to information, They were going to be able to go from these schools or from this education system and plug into literally a factory or an office and conduct work in a predictable way.
So when you ask yourself, what then is the function of a colonial education system? It is to maintain physical, emotional, mental, and psychological systems of control, right? And so when I think of what colonized education looks like, for instance, I imagine systems that encourage rote memorization, for instance. I imagine systems that force you or compel you to sing an anthem at the start of class. I imagine systems that insist on a certain way of speaking, on a certain way of pronouncing words depending on what language you're speaking. So yeah, colonized education, total and complete control.
As a child growing up in Nigeria, my parents were instructed to not speak to me in our local language when in my formative years, because the fear from the teachers and the heads of school in my kindergarten was that if my parents spoke Yoruba language to me, I would not fully learn the English language. But I guess they've been proven wrong, because my parents strategically spoke both languages to us growing up, and my brothers and I speak both languages very fluently.
I read an article by somebody called Michael Young, and he differentiates between powerful knowledge and knowledge of the powerful. And he says that powerful knowledge is a knowledge that can transform our circumstances, that we can use in order to change who we are and change our situations, change our communities. Whereas knowledge of the powerful is knowledge that is privileged and protected by particular groups in order to keep themselves in power.
Julius Nyerere speaks about many people in colonial education going on to the same career types, themselves going on to be teachers or bureaucrats and so on. So I think colonial education is any form of education that one is extremely one-sided. It tells a particular view that a culture has knowledge and what knowledge can and should be and what is right and wrong. So there's a centralization of knowledge. And two, it serves to fulfill certain roles. Rather than creating thinkers that are going to adapt to whatever the future might be, that they are creating technocrats or bureaucrats or particular roles for people to fulfill.
When you look at colonization, it's not only about the political colonization, but it could take so many different forms. I would find it easier to describe it in terms of decolonized education, so that we can see the opposite will be a colonized version. For me, a decolonized one would be where the people own the knowledge and they see themselves through the knowledge that they're learning. That will be decolonized for me.
To decolonize education requires a look at the who are you studying, so not just focusing on particular characters in history that only represent a particular part of the world, but looking at a range of figures, including the figures that are forgotten in history. So for example, if we look at Pan-African figures, we also want to have a discussion with our students not only about figures from the diaspora, so the Garveys and the Du Bois. We also want to have a discussion about the Nkrumahs and the Sankaras, and then we also want to have a discussion about the women that have shaped Pan-African history.
Education must not separate instruction and knowledge from one's identity, one's perspectives, one's culture. And so I think that's one of the weaknesses of colonial education, that it attempted to eliminate one's culture and one's nationality, one's background from the instruction that was being passed across.
Is it possible to decolonize education? I don't know if there's a timeline on it. I think it's a process. Just like colonialism didn't, there's no timeline on it. We're going to arrive on January 1st, and by March 31st, we'll have decolonized. So just like colonialism was instituted through policy, through law, through violence, but then also through the subtle kind of social cultural ways, right? Internalizing in superiority and inferiority, internalizing certain power dynamics, internalizing certain ways of being. All that stuff is soft and happens through the mind. and is passed from generation to generation.
The purpose of education, in my opinion, is to expand the consciousness of society, right? And so decolonized education looks like putting students in a situation where they can create real solutions to real problems, right? Where they learn life skills, they learn how to collaborate with each other. They learn the hard skills they need, math, science, those skills are learned. But really, the skills that help us progress as a society, as a civilization, those in-between skills. How do you look at a problem in your community and solve it, right? And we're not talking about copy-pasting a solution from another country. We're talking about coming up with a real, authentic, innovative solution to an issue in your community. I would say decolonized education is education that empowers the student, right, to empower the community, to fix issues in the community.
In Botswana, at least, we use the term lekgowa, which means white person. So it literally means white person, but we also use it colloquially to mean haore o lekgowa lame, right? You're my boss, you're my chief. So how long will it take to remove that from the language, from the discourse? That's something that's been ingrained over several generations. And yes, it starts in the schoolhouse and with curricula, but it asks us to interrogate even our use of language, our way of seeing things, and to stop saying, or you're doing something sekgowa, which means you're doing it well, which connotes that you're doing it well.
I hope it's more than realistic to say that education can be decolonized. I think it's necessary. I think it's urgent. And I think I'll say two things about this. Firstly, I think some people, when they hear this conversation about decolonizing education, find it frustrating. Because they say, well, colonialism ended 50 years ago, 60 years ago, depending on the countries that you're talking about. Why are we still blaming events that happened 4 generations ago for the problems that we're encountering right now? And yet, the same people will say that they're dissatisfied with the role that education is playing in society. They're dissatisfied with the results that we're getting. They're dissatisfied with the progress we're making economically, with the progress we're making politically. And I think that maybe a way to bridge that gap is to say the reason we feel this urgency about decolonizing education is because we want education to play a purpose of liberation, right? It's not, we don't want it to play the purpose that it was designed for. That's not doing us any good. We want it to set people free.
Well, when we conceived ALA, it was as a response to the fact that we felt the continent was missing a school that did a number of things. One, that brought Africans together from all over the continent. Founders had grown up in different African countries, and we felt in those countries we learned a lot about the country and our colonial masters, but not about the rest of the continent. We felt we needed a school that was actually of high excellence, right? That was recognized within the continent, but also outside as a very high quality school. And we felt we needed a school that really trained not just the next generation of African leaders, not just about to be book smart, but really train them to be entrepreneurs. So we set up the campus in Johannesburg, and over the last 10 years have had sort of 1,000 people come through the network.
I think the fundamental reason why the African Leadership Academy was set up was to address the leadership vacuum in Africa. If you think about it, many of the African countries started getting independence in the 50s and 60s. And since then to today, we've probably had over 230 presidents across Africa in the 54 countries. And you'd struggle to name 10 to 20 presidents who sustainably taken their countries to a better place. And when I say sustainably, I mean they've instituted change that's been embedded in institutions who continue to protect the human rights and the change created. If you think about what are the few things, one or two things you could do to transform Africa, it was very clear that leadership was probably the biggest lever of change on the continent. And that's why you look at countries like Kenya and Ghana, for example, or a couple of others, who in the 60s were probably at par with South Korea. If anything, they're probably more advanced than South Korea then. Today, South Korea's per capita income is probably 5-6 times that of Kenya or Ghana. How do you explain that? Why is it that Africa got left behind when we were on the same starting blocks as a lot of the Asian tigers today? And so it came down to leadership. So we figured out it's better to raise a generation of young leaders than try and fix our current broken men and women.
I first heard of the African Leadership Academy from one of my peers who was fortunate enough to get admitted to ALA. So he was an year ahead. And so looking into what he had to say about the academy, it was something which to me was a good challenge to take up on. And so based on that, I applied and was fortunate enough to be admitted.
I think our South African education system is very weak compared to what we get at ALA, right? I feel like I did, for example, the hardest math there is in South Africa. And when I got here, that is like something very simple, you know? Like you don't even go into depth the things that we do, and if you look at it, our pass mark is like at 40%.
I think the South African education system, from my experience of it, is it's sort of like there's no sort of urgency or urge to encourage people to, you know, think critically about a lot of things and to think widely about a lot of things. It's kind of like you're given one thing and you learn about that, and then like it kind of ends there. And I think something that's been different about my ALA experience is that it's taught me or pushed me, encouraged me to, you know, think critically about a lot of things that I wouldn't have prior to coming here. And that includes thinking critically about the space as well.
For me, the measure of success of my teaching in my classroom, what I hope for my students is that they leave wearing different lenses, right? To read the world critically. I think that's the job of education for me. And so success for me would be that they have interrogated these issues. You know, this morning you came to class and we were talking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. And what Ngugi offers us is a lens through which we can understand what it looks like. What are the symptoms of being, you know, having a colonized psyche. So if they can read their world more critically and look at systems of power, look at curricula, look at you know, the judges wearing British, you know, white long British wigs, look at gender relations, look at the questions around sexuality, and how that's policed and legislated in laws. The first step is to look at it critically, ask the right questions, ask the hard questions, and stimulate discussions and hopefully pull the levers of change.
ALA has had a huge impact on me. For example, I'd like to say that before coming to ALA, I was misogynistic, I was homophobic, and these are things that, you know, that are taught to you by the society you come from, right? And coming here and having to unlearn the things that, you know, were my reality before was a difficult thing. And so I guess I've changed. And it's diversity at its best, like if I can say, because when I got here, I realized, you know, even just from the arguments that you have with fellow students, that the intention is not always being right. It's to learn, right? And so I had to become comfortable with being wrong about things I don't know.
One of the things that we do to respond to that is that we spend our first term in African studies and writing and rhetoric in the humanities, exploring the question, who are you? And we actually have a course called, now I'm I hope the Tswana people will excuse my pronunciation. I'm always getting into trouble, but it's Omang. If it was in society, it would be Umbani. And so it's sort of like, who are you? And through that, we give students different tools to analyze identity.
We've all been taught to see and hear and make certain associations. Our education here, so let's be honest about it, we all carry these stereotypes or preconceptions. And through a series of careful readings and carefully facilitated discussions, I think it's important for us to think about our positionality. So why is it that I see this thing this way? What about my upbringing has led me to make this statement? So a student will make, let's be honest, a student will say something that's perhaps sexist or potentially homophobic or whatever it is. And I don't think our job or my job is to criticize and say, how dare you say this thing, because that view is real. And it's real for millions of people out there. I think what's important is to stop and say, okay, this student said this thing. For that student, what is it about your upbringing that melded you, that shaped you in a way that you see this thing?
You get to go back and see who you are. What are the values that made you who you are? What does your race, for example, or gender play a role in your identity, in the privilege that you get, and where does it take away from you some of the liberties that you were supposed to have as a person? These are things that I had to go and think about. Once I came to ALA, I had to go and see what values made me who I am, what things did I get when I was a child without questioning them, and how can I rethink these things again?
I think one of the most important things that I learned at ALA is how to never be comfortable in who you are. I don't remember myself being comfortable since the first day I came at ALA. There's always something to push me a little farther. So I think that's what I learned most, is to always look for that one thing, that one incentive that's going to push you to be a better person. And I am surrounded every day with people who are willing to be better people. So that motivates me to become better.
We get about anything between 2,500 to 4,000 applications a year from right across the continent. We then take them through a selection process, and we reduce the numbers to about 500 after the first phase of assessment. And the 500, we then tend to have face-to-face assessments with most of them. And that assessment involves us flying to the various capital cities. So we'll go to Accra in Ghana, and we'll bring all the Ghana finalists to Accra. Johannesburg will host all the South African finalists. Nairobi will host all the Kenyan finalists. And we spend a full day with them doing a battery of assessments. We're very deliberate about getting 50% boys, 50% girls. And we try to make sure that the young people that we bring into the academy come here irrespective of their socioeconomic backgrounds. So we take a whole cross-section of Africans. Majority of them are from disadvantaged backgrounds, but also we take a good chunk of middle class and we take a good chunk of upper class.
Well, to raise money for ALA was a journey, right? To give you a sense, we've raised $150 million over the last 10 years. But at the beginning, it was friends and family, right? We started with, a number of us just funding it. Peter and I actually funded it for quite a while. And then we decided, well, let's actually start to raise money from, interesting parties who were, who we knew. So it was very close friends and family. We actually launched a campaign. It's probably an early stage of a GoFundMe, which was buy a brick. So if you come to ALA, you'll see a brick wall, and these are all people who contributed somewhere between $25 and I think at the time it was up to $500 to buy a brick. I raised about $30,000 through that. And initially, all we had was a piece of paper saying this is an idea. And they all loved the idea, but it was actually hard to get them to commit some money to it. But eventually, we had some people bet on us, some very early funders who bet on us. Until today, they've been active supporters. And then what we found is then once people bet on you and actually you commit to delivering, and you deliver, they get even more excited, right? So a number of our funders have come back to support us over the years. Once we had a campus and we had students, it became a lot easier because it wasn't us going and telling the story, just bring them to campus and put them in front of the students, and the students blow them away.
This is Leroy Maseru. Leroy is a 20-year-old student from Kenya completing a second year at the academy. Leroy's hobbies include reading, saving the environment, and spending time on the Forbes list. At number 2. When Leroy was 15, he founded a company called GreenPact. GreenPact uses Leroy-developed technology to convert human waste into energy.
Back in Kenya, I run a social enterprise called GreenPact. And so GreenPact is a conscious social enterprise that deals with the renewable energy, that's biogas. It's a project that began as a high school project back in Maseno School. And once I graduated from Maseno School, I made it into a limited liability company. GreenPact has taught me a lot of things. Some of the things that I've learned from GreenPact is dealing with a team and leading a team, and not just leading a team, but leading for impact. And this is a trait that I've been able to perfect here at the African Leadership Academy, and even as I transit now from the African Leadership Academy to now the world, I think I'm better placed to now be able to serve my local community back in Kenya.
With the goal of creating leaders who find solutions to the problems they face, the African Leadership Academy has been the meeting ground for a group of students who seem to have solved the problem of election and voter fraud. That's right, it seems as if they've cured voter fraud. Now listen carefully, because this part gets a little complicated. Normal elections in our country and many other countries are run from a centralized voting system. In South Africa, we have the IEC, who sit in our nation's capital, where they tally up and release the votes from around the country. A centralized system. Now, these students have seen the vulnerability of using a centralized system, because if you want to corrupt the results, you can easily bribe someone and turn the results in your favor. However, if you decentralize the system, you take the power out of the hands of a few and you place it in the hands of many. Meaning, if you want to hack the elections or bribe your way into power, you would have to bribe millions of people.
I think for us, this system that we created, it was more of like trying to ensure, that accountability of the electoral body in school, which is the ESC, right? And making sure that so much power is not left to one body to manage the whole election, right? In a more of like a small environment, but something that we hope will achieve a big impact, right?
So if we were to implement this system in South Africa, this could see an end to the many cases of electoral fraud that we hear about each and every election season. From stolen party votes, recounts done in secret, the mystery of the Alexander ballots that is yet to be explained. If we as a people are serious about change, serious about becoming the change we've been waiting for, then we will acknowledge that throughout history, political will has never risen when the voices of the people remained silent. But if we could possibly consider the implementation of a system that has possibly never been implemented as an electoral system anywhere else in the world, created by 4 African students from Uganda, Morocco, and Kenya, we may be on track to solving a global problem with a solution that is proudly made in Africa.
I know in Kenya there's always a huge divide between the Luos and the Kikuyus. So I happen to have a Kikuyu dad and a Luo mom, and it's actually an interesting thing, because Raila Odinga is Luo and Uhuru Kenyatta is Kikuyu. And each and every single election, there's always the thought of, you Kikuyus stole votes from us, the Luos. And imagine going home up country and meeting your grandparents, and you're like, your grandparents from the other side, they stole elections for us this time. And just thinking about that whole thing being pushed to you. And I'm very passionate about politics, so you can imagine how much investment I gave into understanding what are the ways we can improve the system. As you get to learn, you realize that it's not just elections that could benefit from this. There's a whole range of industries. And that's why what we do actually is not just deal with blockchain elections, but rather, what potential does blockchain speak for Africa itself?
There is also a course that prepares learners for real-life working situations called Entrepreneurial Leadership. Students create or join a company, becoming its CEO or CFO or any other executive position that will have to fulfill its duties and answer to an external board of real-life industry experts who help to ensure that the day these students enter a real boardroom, they will enter with a sense of familiarity.
Every student on campus has to run a business on campus. So we have about 26 student-run enterprises at any point in time. These are run in teams of about 5 to 8 students. And at that stage, we start teaching young people on campus how to work in teams. Because when you go to the workplace, you'll be working in teams. And as I said, once again, in my corporate days, I didn't learn about the forming and norming of teams until I was in my late 20s, early 30s. But at this very young age, young people start realizing and being taught about how the process that teams go through to become effective.
We also simulate what we call the Student Enterprise Program. The Student Enterprise Program is a simulation of business development and business management with an economy that is run by the Entrepreneurial Leadership Department here at ALA. So to give an example, we have various student-led enterprises that have their own managers, that have their own founders, that have their own financial officers, and they meet every week during a time which we call Build Lab. And during these Build Lab sessions, we have engaging, interactive business development, business management sessions amongst the students and their various coaches and facilitators. This is all towards enabling them to position themselves in this working world, which they will soon move into. Earlier, I tried to speak of addressing a need, right? We want to be solution-driven and addressing a need that we see exists in society. And in doing so, we have our conventional subjects, biology, science, mathematics, but there should also be this notion to be entrepreneurial and to have ethics in this entrepreneurial venture that you seek to carry out, which is accompanied by leadership. Hence, we believe that entrepreneurial leadership is something that can be taught, framed on courage and them believing and empowering themselves.
I've continued to act with my own NGO, in which we help orphans to get education access in my country. While being here, I continue doing that.
Last summer, I ran a boot camp, and building a box boot camp, where I plowed back the knowledge that I'd gotten from the EL, the entrepreneurial leadership curriculum that I learned here at a refugee camp back in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, as well as trying to build my own initiatives. I built an organization known as Peace Power South Sudan, an initiative that tries to bring peace to South Sudan through engagement of young leaders. And this is courtesy of the awesome knowledge that I got from this institution.
On the 25th of May, the year was 1963. 32 African nations came together and formed the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. After decades of failing to realize its true potential, on the 26th of May 2001, exactly 38 years and 1 day later, the Organization of African Unity was disbanded and what we know today as the African Union was formed. However, 17 years later, many people across the continent have felt that the AU has also let them down. This has created a sense of dissatisfaction in many, irritation in some, and possibly even a sense of hate in others.
Don't hate it, fix it, right? Don't hate it. Don't dismiss the African Union. Can we take the time to learn as much as we can about the African Union in its current expression? What are the weaknesses of the AU? What are the achievements of the AU? How do we prepare the next generation of people who will influence change through the AU? That was the birth of the Model African Union. The people who are doing this are 15 to 19 years old on average. They've got perhaps 10, 20, 30 years before they can actually step into those positions. How much more beautiful this continent will be if we've prepared people 30 years before their time, 20 years before their time, 10 years before their time. Let's not wait until it's election time and say, who's got good ideas? Can we vote for you?
So to clarify, the Model African Union is a mock African Union debate conceptualized by Staffel member Faith Abiodun, which he supervises with the assistance of colleague Maya Shukloni and is run completely by the students. They are given the responsibility of inviting 500 scholars from around the continent, whom they must raise funds to fly, feed, and accommodate for an entire week of research debate, which they compile and present in the city of Johannesburg.
I am involved in a class called Model African Union Research, and so they every year simulate the African Union, and they pretend to be chairpeople of their committees so that they can think more deeply about questions related to public health or questions related to governance and transparency. And so I think each student will find their way, maybe not, will be absolutely set at the end of the ALA journey knowing exactly what they want to do, but definitely there'll be a range of areas that they'll be going into, and I hope leading the way in those areas.
The importance of the African Union may not lay within the walls of the Parliament in Midrand, but rather it can be found in the name, the word union. From the Latin unus, meaning one. Despite our many borders, we live on one continent. We all believe in the word Ubuntu, whether we are from Mali, Nigeria, Egypt, or South Africa. And we cannot claim to carry the spirit of Ubuntu if we treat our brothers and sisters from other nations as if they are less human than we are. For we come from the same cradle. Our ancestors suckled the same breast. So when we discriminate against our fellow brothers and sisters, we are in fact discriminating against ourselves.
The history and the science and the economics tell us a very clear answer, and that's that when you welcome other people, they multiply your wealth, they multiply your richness, they multiply your diversity, they multiply your strength, rather than diminish it. But that seems counterintuitive. It seems weird that when you open the door and let the neighbors in, that they're going to make you wealthier. Because aren't they going to eat my food? Aren't they going to eat what's in the fridge? But the reality is people want to create things. People don't want to live on handouts. People don't want to take. They want to make. And history bears that out. And so I think that when South Africa grapples with questions of xenophobia or Afrophobia, as you might call it, it risks missing an opportunity to capitalize on the gains that it's already made and to step up to a leadership role on the continental and global stage in a way that very, very many people need it to.
When I first came to South Africa, I was actually very surprised at the level of ignorance that I saw many people hold about the rest of the continent. And it bothered me. To live in a society like this, that is blessed, that is beautiful, has all kinds of people in it, that chooses almost deliberately or fortuitously to separate itself mentally and otherwise from engaging with the rest of the continent, perhaps because of a sense of exceptionalism. Thinking that, we are far better than they are. We don't experience the things they experience. We don't have outbreaks of diseases, all kinds of things. Breaking news. People outside this country know lots of things that really, really, really are bad about this country. And they don't like those things either.
I struggle to wrap my head around the thought that this is a deliberate action. I think it's a reaction to possible actions that have occurred in the past. We as Africans have never been as welcoming to other Africans. It's not just something that has happened here in South Africa. It's happened all over the world. It's happened all over Africa. As we migrate and we think of evolving and creating new life elsewhere, I think it's very key to also recognize the environment that you're in and not completely isolate yourself from that.
When you discriminate against someone else, like what are you trying to do when you other somebody and you sort of create this boundary and you emphasize your difference, and I think when we're doing that, it's driven from like some sort of fear about yourself, like a sort of a need for there to be something less, or for to be able to differentiate yourself from a group in order for you to have power.
So it's come up a few times in classes, and the majority of times is brought up by students from outside South Africa. So I think from a South African perspective, speaking as a South African, I think we need a greater sense of accountability and ownership for our roles. just sort of subtle slurs that we may use when speaking about people from the continent, the way that we view people coming into work within South Africa and so on. So I think the dialogue has mainly been raised by students from outside South Africa. My question would be, where are the South Africans in my classroom raising this question, speaking about it, speaking about how, as a nation, we all are complicit in this?
Because I come from a Muslim country, so basically, you see, pretty much the norm is being a Muslim and just abiding to the rules, and actually being here, like, got me thinking about how we can actually live together differently, even though we are not the same.
Diversity is just that. It's nothing to be explained. It's nothing to be wished away, but it is just that. And accepting diversity and actually embracing it has been great for me as a person, because I think a lot of the challenges we face on the continent can be solved if we could come together.
I've changed a lot, you know, and that is something that even my parents have noticed, you know, from the first term, from when I left home, and then compared to, you know, having a full first term experience. I think I'm definitely more independent. I have extremely good time management skills. And I think essentially, yeah, there's a lot of things that I'm still hoping to learn. You know, I know this experience is it's not complete. You know, it's a 2-year journey and it's only been the first year. So I don't know, like right now I'm at a point where I don't really see a lot of what the school has done for me because I'm so entrenched into the system. Sometimes it's difficult really to see, you know, all the benefits of it. But I think as I, you know, approach university, even being in university, I'll then see, you know, the fruits of this institution. But right now, it still seems like I've got this work and I've got so much work. It seems so intense that I don't really see that at this point in time.
When I came here, my students asked me, how was your years when you were at A? Like, I tell them I felt like I was in a pressure cooker. That's the best way to describe it, because there is a lot going on. There's so much going on. You're expected to excel in your academics. You're also expected to excel in all extracurricular activities. So it's very intense. So when I was here, I'm afraid to say the mission and vision kind of took a step back. It's after I left, I realized that I have really matured as a person. I have really developed some critical skills. And most importantly, this is something that I credit ALA for, is I had developed a truly African passion. Before I came here, I used to see myself as an Ethiopian. That was pretty much it. But after graduating from ALA, I saw myself as an African, and that's how I identify now.
Well, for the future of ALA, one is continuing down this path. I mean, we've come a long way. We have 1,000 students who've come through. And again, you know, for us, you know, you're with us for life, right? So we have a whole team that we call a lifelong engagement team that actually helps the students, plays them back in jobs. 80% of our students end up in university in the US.
So the whole question about, so it's great you have ALA. How can we build more ALAs across South Africa and across Africa is a question we get all the time. But I think the big question we need to be asking ourselves, how can Africa learn from what we've done? How can Africa replicate what we've done? And we believe that the best way to do that is not so much by us going to build more ALAs, because the rate of scale or reach will be too slow. So instead of building and scaling out our software, our hardware, we believe it's best if we scale out our software. So we are sharing what we've learned here with other partners. We are inviting teachers from schools come here. They go through programs here where we share with them what we do. We involve a couple of different programs where we bring schools, students from other schools to come here and join our students in various other ways. So we figured out that the best way for us to help Africa access the knowledge we've built is through the IP, is through the software, through sharing aspects of our curriculum, and through inviting people to be part of our community. And that, I think, is what we're going to do. I don't think we'll be building any more ALAs as such, because that's probably not the most efficient way for us to help Africa access what we've learned.
This is the African Leadership Academy. Like any ordinary academy, there are buildings, teachers, students, and green grass. However, when you take a closer look, things begin to seem a little more extraordinary. But extraordinary does not necessarily mean perfect. Students are faced with an inconceivable amount of pressure from the moment they enter these gates. The pressure to be accepted into the school. And once you're accepted into the school, there is suddenly the pressure to not fail.
Felt like I was in a pressure cooker.
Or when you eventually do fail, there is suddenly the pressure to fail forward. Teachers are entrusted with helping these young minds navigate the course to their true potential, and that is an unimaginable pressure as well. But do we give up because there is pressure? Do we give in because it's difficult? Do we encourage the current state of our country's education system to continue because it would be too hard trying to decolonize education? Do we truly believe that lowering pass marks down to 40 and 30% is truly the answer to our continent's leadership vacuum? Learning about Churchill, Roosevelt, but not Kwame Nkrumah, Haile Selassie, or Dorothy Nyembe? One of the biggest steps we can take towards decolonizing education is by refusing to settle for less. Because once we refuse to settle for less, we will begin to actively seek more. This is made in Africa, and today we are seeking more.
I talk to like young South African kids are talking about like colonial structures must fall, colonial education must fall. The big thing you need to ask yourself is that table is built, right? That structure is built. Ask yourself outside the formal education system, what's being done to sow the seeds in the minds of the people, of the young people. A different kind of future is possible, that a higher future is possible, a future that is open to all is actually possible. Because ultimately, one of the big things I learned from ALA is that by and large, the students end up influencing what gets taught, because the students become the teachers. And so, there's a duplicity of being a revolutionary, is that you at once have to learn how to blend in to the status quo so that you can then subvert it and turning it into something new. So I would say to the kids, look, you need to empower yourselves outside, get into the system, right? Because a system is useful. It takes decades to build a system. Get into the system, and then from the inside, subvert. Affirmative sabotage. I can't remember the name of the lady who coined that, but your role is to be an affirmative saboteur. Get into their schools, get into the banks, get into policy, get into parliament, become celebrities, and then from your positions of power, you can create the world you want. Got a little intense there, didn't it? A man. Yeah. Oh my goodness.